The thing about humans is that they never shut up. 3 cycles ago, when the Galactic Council hired Dr. Mira Kensington as their official translator, we thought we were being clever. Humans were new to the political stage, loud and chaotic, but their linguistic databases were exceptional. We needed someone who could bridge the gap between 73 member species, and this particular human came with credentials that made even our archivists nod in approval. What we didn't anticipate was that she'd be the one to accidentally sentence 4,000 beings to death. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Velk, Senior Adjunct to the Council's Diplomatic Operations, and I've spent the better part of 200 years ensuring that intergalactic relations don't collapse into nuclear chaos. I'm a Vraxan, which means I stand roughly 8 feet tall, have 4 arms that I use primarily for excessive gesturing during arguments, and possess a natural immunity to most toxins. That last, the part becomes relevant later. The day everything went sideways started like any other morning in the Council's central hub on Station Apex. I was reviewing trade disputes from the Krell mining colonies when Mira burst into my office without knocking, which she did approximately 6 times a week despite my repeated explanations about proper protocol. "Velk, we have a problem," she announced, dropping a datapad onto my desk with enough force to make my morning stimulant splash over the rim of its container. "You have 17 problems, as I count them," I replied, gesturing at the stack of violation notices she'd accumulated, including operating a human beverage synthesizer in a zone designated for Quarantine Level 3 equipment. That's called a coffee maker, and it's essential to human cognitive function, she shot back, her brown eyes flashing with that peculiar defiance humans seem to manufacture from thin air. But that's not what I'm talking about. The Tarkellian delegation just submitted their treaty revisions, and there's a phrase in there that doesn't translate properly into standard galactic. I felt my secondary arms begin their unconscious stress-knitting motion, weaving invisible patterns in the air. The Tarkellians were notoriously particular about language. Their entire culture revolved around the precise arrangement of words, and a mistranslation could range from mildly offensive to catastrophically genocidal. "Show me," I said. Mira pulled up the document, her fingers flying across the holographic interface with practiced ease. Humans had adapted to our technology with unsettling speed, another trait that made the older species nervous. She highlighted a section near the end of the treaty, where the Tarkellians outlined their conditions for joining the expanded mining consortium. The phrase in question glowed red against the blue backdrop. Velshara Kuntanik Mor. Standard translation protocols render this as, "We accept with honor," Mira explained, chewing on her lower lip. A gesture I'd learned meant she was deeply concerned. But that's not quite right. The root word kun has 3 distinct meanings, depending on tonal inflection, and Tarkellian written language doesn't include tonal markers because they assume contextual understanding from native speakers. "And the 3 meanings are?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this was heading. "Accept, acknowledge, or execute." She let that last word hang in the air between us like a death sentence, which, depending on how this played out, it very well might be. I closed all 4 of my eyes for a moment, a prayer to ancestors who probably weren't listening. "You're telling me that we've been operating under a treaty interpretation that could be read as a death warrant? Not just could be, is being." Mira pulled up another screen, this one showing communication logs from the Tarkellian homeworld. "I've been monitoring their internal channels, which technically violates about 15 council regulations, but I figured you'd prefer I break rules rather than start a war. They've been talking about the upcoming cleansing for the past 6 days. I thought it was religious terminology until I cross-referenced their historical database. The files she showed me made my chromatic skin shift to a pale gray, the Vraxan equivalent of going white as a sheet. The Tarkellians had a documented history of what they called contractual executions, Massive purges triggered by treaty violations or, in this case, what they perceived as deliberate insult through mistranslation. How many? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 4,312 individuals across 17 colony stations, Mira said quietly. All marked for execution in 3 days when the treaty's grace period expires. They think we deliberately mistranslated their acceptance as a threat, which in their culture is grounds for what they call proportional cleansing. They're going to kill everyone involved in the mining consortium as retribution. I stood up so fast my chair skittered backward into the wall. We need to convene an emergency council session immediately. We can correct the translation, issue a formal apology. Already tried, Mira interrupted, which would normally earn her a reprimand, but circumstances had moved well beyond normal. I sent 7 priority communications to the Tarkellian ambassador. All were returned with the same automated response. The period for linguistic clarification has passed. Contractual obligations will be honored. They're going to go through with it, I said, not really a question. Unless we can prove the mistranslation was accidental and not a deliberate insult, Mira confirmed. Which brings me to the interesting part. There's an interesting part to mass execution? I couldn't keep the sarcasm out of my voice. Mira smiled, that unhinged expression humans got when they thought they were being clever. The treaty includes a provision for linguistic tribunal, an ancient Tarkellian custom that allows disputed translations to be resolved through formal debate. If I can prove in front of their High Council that the mistranslation was a result of systemic error rather than intentional disrespect, they're bound by their own laws to cancel the execution order. And if you can't prove it? Her smile didn't waver. Then, the execution proceeds, and I probably get added to the list for wasting their time. This was why humans were simultaneously the Council's greatest asset and biggest liability. They looked at certain death and saw it as a challenge to overcome, through sheer stubbornness and what they called winging it. You realize this tribunal will take place on Tarkellian Prime, I said. Their home world, under their jurisdiction, with their rules. I'm aware, Mira said. Which is why I already booked transport. We leave in 4 hours. We? You're coming with me, she stated, as if this were obvious. I need a council witness to verify the proceedings. And also, you're the only person here who actually seems to give a damn about whether 4,000 people die. That was unfair, but not entirely inaccurate. The council operated on a principle of calculated apathy, intervening only when absolutely necessary to maintain the illusion of order. 4,000 deaths from a member species would be noted, mourned in official statements, and ultimately filed away as an unfortunate diplomatic incident, unless someone chose to make it their problem. 4 hours, I repeated. That's not enough time to prepare a proper defense. Then, it's a good thing humans specialize in improper defenses, Mira said, already heading toward the door. Pack light. Tarkellian gravity is 1.3 standard, and their atmospheric composition makes most species drowsy. Oh, and bring antacid tablets. Their ceremonial food is designed to test intestinal fortitude. She left before I could formulate a proper objection, which was probably her strategy. I stood in my office, surrounded by 2 centuries of carefully maintained protocol and procedure, and realized I was about to throw it all away to follow a human into what would almost certainly be a diplomatic catastrophe. I started packing. The transport to Tarkellian Prime took 16 hours, most of which Mira spent hunched over her datapad, muttering to herself in what I recognized as at least 7 different Earth languages. Humans were peculiar in that they'd developed thousands of distinct communication systems on a single planet. And somehow, Mira had crammed a significant portion of them into her brain. I'm missing something, she said for the 47th time. There's a pattern here, but I can't quite see it. Perhaps if you rested, I suggested. Human cognitive function deteriorates significantly without adequate sleep cycles. I'll sleep when 4,000. People aren't scheduled to die, she snapped, then immediately looked apologetic. Sorry. I get cranky when facing existential deadlines. Noted, I said dryly. The thing that struck me about Mira, and by extension, most humans I'd encountered, was their inability to accept inevitable outcomes. Where other species would calculate probability and adjust expectations accordingly, humans seemed to operate on the assumption that rules could be bent, systems could be gamed, and death could be argued with. It was exhausting and occasionally inspiring in equal measure. Tell me about the tribunal process, Mira said, pulling up a new set of files. What should I expect? I settled into the passenger couch, arranging my arms in a comfortable configuration. Tarkellian linguistic tribunals are ancient, predating their spacefaring era by several thousand years. The process involves 3 phases. First, the presentation of error, where you'll outline the mistranslation and its causes. Second, the challenge of intent, where the Tarkellian High Council will attempt to prove the error was deliberate. Third, the resolution of truth, where both sides present their final arguments and the Council renders judgment. Sounds straightforward, Mira said. It would be, except for one detail. I paused, wondering if she'd reconsider this insane plan. The tribunal is conducted entirely in High Tarkellian, a language that uses contextual harmonics, gestural syntax, and what they call truth resonance, a form of subsonic communication that most species can't produce or perceive. Mira looked up from her datapad, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not fear, but something sharper. Focus. How long do I have to learn High Tarkellian? She asked. Based on current travel time? 12 hours and 14 minutes. She laughed, that short bark of sound humans made when confronted with the absurd. Well, that's just fantastic. Any other impossible requirements I should know about? If you fail the challenge of intent, Tarkellian law requires you to undergo linguistic purification, which involves having your tongue removed to prevent future mistranslations. Mira blinked once, twice, then returned to her datapad. Good to know, she muttered. Added to the list of things I'm going to succeed at avoiding. I wanted to tell her that bravado wouldn't save her, that the Tarkellian High Council had conducted 412 tribunals in their recorded history, and the accused had won exactly 0 times. That she was walking into a system designed to validate Tarkellian superiority and punish outsiders who dared challenge their linguistic authority. But I didn't say any of those things, because I'd come to understand something about humans over the past 3 cycles. They didn't need to hear the odds. They'd already calculated them and decided to proceed anyway. So instead, I pulled up my own files and began teaching Mira a language that took most species 20 years to master, knowing we had less than half a day. It was going to be a very long night. When we arrived at Tarkellian Prime, I was reasonably certain Mira had absorbed approximately 15% of what I'd attempted to teach her, which, given the time frame, was either impressive or terrifying, possibly both. The planet itself was beautiful in that cold, austere way that cultures built on rigid hierarchy tended to produce. Everything was geometric, precise, calculated to within millimeters of perfection. The landing platform where we disembarked could have been used as a surgical theater, so sterile was its design. Our greeting party consisted of 5 Tarkellians in formal tribunal robes, their crystalline exoskeletons catching the light of their pale sun and refracting it in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The lead figure, who I recognized from council databases as High Adjudicator Shenva, approached with movements so controlled they might have been pre-programmed. Translator Mira Kensington, Shenva spoke in standard Galactic, their voice like grinding glass. You have invoked ancient right of linguistic tribunal. This is unexpected. I appreciate you honoring the request, High Adjudicator, Mira replied, her tone respectful but not submissive. Humans had a talent for walking that particular tightrope. I believe I can demonstrate that the translation error was systemic rather than intentional. Many believe many things, Shenva said. Belief and truth are not synonymous. You will present your evidence at the appointed time. Until then, you are guests of the High Council, which means you are both honored and monitored. The last part wasn't a threat so much as a statement of fact. Tarkellians didn't bother with implied menace. They preferred explicit clarity. We were escorted to quarters that were, predictably, perfect. Every surface aligned at precise angles. Every amenity placed according to mathematical formulas that probably had religious significance. I found it oppressive. Mira seemed fascinated. Look at this, she said, running her hand along a wall panel that shifted colors based on ambient temperature. They've incorporated environmental feedback into their architecture. The building is essentially communicating with its occupants. Mira, I said carefully, you're about to go on trial for mistranslation that could result in 4,000 deaths and your own mutilation. Perhaps now is not the time for architectural appreciation. She turned to face me, and her expression was serious. This is exactly the time, Velk, because everything here is about communication. The buildings, the clothes, the way Shenva moved, it's all language. And if I'm going to win tomorrow, I need to understand not just what Tarkellians say, but what they mean. This was the thing about humans that the Council never quite grasped. They were pattern recognition machines, operating at speeds that defied logical explanation. Give them incomplete data, impossible timeframes, and circumstances that would paralyze most species, and somehow they'd find connections that shouldn't exist. It was maddening and occasionally miraculous. The tribunal begins at dawn, I told her. That gives you 6 hours to rest. I'll rest later, Mira said, already pulling up more files. Right now, I need to figure out how to speak a language that uses sound, gesture, and subsonic vibration simultaneously, and do it well enough to convince a council that's never been wrong that they're wrong. When you put it that way, it sounds impossible. She grinned. Yeah, well, humans have a saying about impossible tasks. Which is, hold my beer and watch this. I didn't know what beer was, but I suspected it wasn't relevant to the current situation. Dawn on Tarkellian Prime arrived with mathematical precision, the sun cresting the horizon at the exact moment predicted by astronomers 3,000 years ago. Tarkellians loved that sort of thing. The tribunal chamber was located in the council's central tower, a structure so tall it literally pierced the cloud layer. We ascended via gravitational lift, and with each level, I felt the weight of what we were attempting settle more heavily on my shoulders. Mira, for her part, looked calm. Too calm. Which meant she was either incredibly confident or had passed through panic into a state of detached acceptance. The chamber itself was circular, with 7 elevated platforms arranged around a central speaking area. Each platform held a member of the High Council, their crystalline forms catching light from sources I couldn't identify and casting rainbow patterns across the polished floor. Translator Mira Kensington, Shenva's voice echoed from the highest platform. You stand before the High Council of Tarkellian Prime to dispute a matter of linguistic interpretation. Do you understand the gravity of this proceeding? I do, High Adjudicator, Mira replied, in standard Galactic. Then we shall begin with the presentation of error. You claim the mistranslation was systemic rather than intentional. Explain. Mira stepped into the central speaking area, and I saw her take a deep breath. Then, she did something I hadn't expected. She began to speak in High Tarkellian. The words that came from her mouth weren't just sounds. They were layered, complex, with harmonic overtones that I could barely perceive, and subsonic frequencies that I felt, rather than heard. Her hands moved in patterns that matched the syntax, creating a visual component to her speech that transformed language into a form of three-dimensional art. And the council, every single member of them, froze. "The error," Mira said, and her voice resonated through the chamber like a bell, "originates not from malice, but from incomplete understanding of your language's fundamental nature. Standard galactic translation protocols assume linear communication. One word follows another, meaning builds sequentially. But High Tarkellian operates on simultaneous layers of expression. The word kun isn't three separate meanings. It's three meanings existing in superposition, and the speaker's intent determines which reality manifests." She paused, and in that pause, the subsonic component of her speech continued, carrying information I couldn't consciously process but somehow understood. The original treaty translation missed this because we were listening for words when we should have been listening for truth. And the truth is that the Tarkellian delegation meant acceptance, acknowledgement, and execution all at once. Not as threat, but as promise. To accept the treaty, to acknowledge its weight, and to execute its terms with precision. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, HFY spoke, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I heard something in their voice that might have been surprise. "You learned High Tarkellian in less than one rotation of our planet," they said. "This is not possible." Mira smiled, and there was something dangerous in that expression. "High Adjudicator," she said, still speaking in that layered, harmonic way. "With all respect, you just identified the core of our species' defining trait. Humans don't do things because they're possible. We do them because they're necessary. And that's when I realized we might actually survive this. Or we were about to die in spectacular fashion. Either way, it was going to be interesting." The High Council's silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 47 seconds. I'd started counting as a distraction from my mounting certainty that Mira had just either saved 4,000 lives or signed all of our death warrants with impressive linguistic flair. HFY leaned forward on their platform, and the light refracting through their crystalline form shifted from cool blue to something warmer, almost amber. In Tarkellian body language, this indicated either deep contemplation or preparation for violence. Sometimes both. "Your pronunciation is adequate," HFY said finally, which, from a Tarkellian, was practically effusive praise. However, adequate performance does not constitute proof of systemic error. We move now to the challenge of intent. Another council member, this one shorter and broader than HFY, rose from their platform. The identification marker on their robes indicated they were Adjudicator Threnkal, specialist in what the Tarkellians called truth extraction, which was exactly as pleasant as it sounded. "Translator Kensington," Threnkal began, their voice lower and rougher than HFY's grinding glass tones. "You assert the mistranslation was accidental. Yet council records show you have been employed as official translator for 3 standard cycles. In that time, you have processed 42,000 documents, attended 617 diplomatic sessions, and facilitated communication between 73 member species." "That's correct," Mira replied, still maintaining her harmonic speech pattern. I noticed sweat beginning to form on her forehead. Speaking High Tarkellian required muscular control most species didn't possess, and maintaining it was physically exhausting. "Then explain how a translator of your experience could make such a fundamental error," Threnkal pressed. "Incompetence? Or perhaps something more calculated?" This was the trap. Admit incompetence, and she invalidated her own credentials, making future translations suspect. Claim calculation, and the execution order stood. Humans would call it a no-win scenario, which historically they treated as a personal challenge rather than a deterrent. Mira's hands shifted into a new gestural pattern, and when she spoke, her words carried subsonic frequencies that made my inner ear ache. "Neither," she said. The error stems from a flaw in the translation matrix itself, a flaw that has existed since the Tarkellian language was first added to the standard galactic database 473 cycles ago. Now she had everyone's attention. Questioning the translation matrix was tantamount to questioning the foundation of intergalactic communication. It was bold, dangerous, and typically fatal to one's career. "Elaborate," Shenva commanded. Mira pulled out her datapad, and a holographic projection bloomed in the center of the chamber, showing the linguistic database entry for High Tarkellian. When your species joined the Galactic Council, the initial translation protocols were established by a team of archivists who had studied Tarkellian for an average of 60 standard years. Impressive, certainly. But they made one critical assumption. She manipulated the hologram, highlighting a section of code deep in the database architecture. They assumed that because High Tarkellian uses subsonic frequencies, those frequencies were supplementary to the primary verbal component. Emphasis, if you will. Like how humans might raise their voice for importance or lower it for secrecy. And this assumption was incorrect? Threnkal asked, but their tone suggested they already knew the answer. Completely, Mira confirmed. The subsonic component isn't supplementary. It's foundational. The verbal sounds and gestures are actually the emphasis, the decorative layer on top of the true communication happening below conscious hearing. Which means every translation from High Tarkellian for the past 4.5 centuries has been, at best, incomplete. At worst, catastrophically wrong. The implications of what she was saying hit the chamber like a physical force. If she was right, it meant hundreds of treaties, thousands of diplomatic exchanges, and countless legal documents were all based on flawed translations. It was either brilliant or insane. Knowing Mira, probably both. You dare suggest that 4 centuries of diplomatic relations have been built on misunderstanding? Another council member spoke up, this one named Jevrin, and their tone carried harmonics that translated roughly to outraged disbelief mixed with homicidal curiosity. I'm suggesting that 4 centuries of diplomatic relations have succeeded despite misunderstanding, Mira corrected, and I had to admire her courage in the face of 7 crystalline beings who could order her dismemberment with a single harmonic chord. Because here's the interesting part. Tarkellians knew. That statement landed like an explosive device in a library. Explain, Shenva said, their voice now carrying frequencies I definitely couldn't hear, but felt in my bones. You've always known that other species couldn't fully comprehend High Tarkellian, Mira continued, her hands weaving patterns that somehow made her words more persuasive. But rather than correct the archivist's assumptions, you let the flawed translation matrix stand because it gave you an advantage. A built-in excuse for diplomatic flexibility. When a treaty interpretation favored you, you could accept the surface translation. When it didn't, you could claim mistranslation based on the deeper subsonic meaning. The silence that followed this accusation was different from before. This wasn't contemplative. This was dangerous. You accuse the High Council of deliberate deception, Threnkal said, and their crystalline form began to glow from within, a sign of elevated energy output that usually preceded acts of violence. No, Mira said quickly, but not desperately. She'd anticipated this reaction. I'm pointing out a cultural survival mechanism. The Tarkellian species evolved in an environment where precision in communication meant the difference between life and death. Your entire civilization is built on linguistic clarity. So when you encountered species that couldn't match that clarity, you adapted. You created a buffer zone of intentional ambiguity that allowed for diplomatic maneuvering while maintaining your cultural integrity. She paused, letting the harmonic echoes of her words fade before continuing. The problem is that the buffer zone only works when both parties understand it exists. The mistranslation in the Mining Consortium Treaty wasn't an insult. It was a sign that the Council's linguistic safety net has become so normalized that even you've forgotten it's there. I watched the High Council members exchange glances, or what passed for glances among beings who communicated through frequency as much as sight. Something was happening. A conversation in layers I couldn't fully perceive, and I had no idea if Mira's gambit was working, or if we were seconds away from being escorted to an execution chamber. Shenva stood fully upright on their platform, and the movement caused light to cascade across the chamber in patterns that hurt to observe directly. "Your theory is provocative," they said. "But theory, without proof, is merely speculation. You claim systemic error. Demonstrate it." Mira smiled, and I recognized that expression. It was the look she got when she'd been holding a winning hand the entire time and was finally allowed to play it. "I can do better than demonstrate," she said. "I can fix it." She manipulated her data pad, and the holographic projection shifted, showing lines of code that began reorganizing themselves in real time. "For the past 6 days, while you were planning executions and I was supposedly learning your language, I've actually been doing something else. I've been rewriting the translation matrix from the ground up, incorporating subsonic frequency analysis that accounts for the foundational communication layer you use." The code continued to evolve, branching and recombining in patterns that looked almost organic. The new matrix doesn't just translate words, it translates intent, context, and emotional resonance. It captures what you actually mean, not just what you literally say. Another council member, Prensha, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "And you developed this in 6 days? What the archivists could not achieve in 4 centuries. "The archivists were working with limited data and incorrect assumptions," Mira replied. "I had the benefit of their failures, access to your full linguistic database, and the motivation of knowing that 4,000 people would die if I couldn't solve this problem. Turns out, existential deadlines are excellent for cognitive performance. Show us," Shenva commanded. Mira activated the new translation matrix, and suddenly the chamber was filled with text. Every previous conversation between Tarkellian and council representatives appeared in holographic form, showing both the old translation and the new one side by side. The differences were staggering. Trade agreements that seemed straightforward in the old translation revealed layers of conditional obligations in the new one. Diplomatic pleasantries that appeared simple were actually complex. Acknowledgements of hierarchy and status. And the Mining Consortium Treaty, the document that started this entire mess, transformed from a simple acceptance into something far more nuanced. "Velshara Kuntanik Mor," Mira read from the new translation. "We accept this agreement with honor, acknowledge its binding nature across all signatory parties, and commit to executing its terms with the precision and dedication befitting Tarkellian standards of excellence." She turned to face Shenva directly. Not a threat. Not an insult. A promise of commitment, delivered in the layered complexity that High Tarkellian allows. The old matrix couldn't capture that complexity, so it defaulted to the simplest interpretation, which happened to be catastrophically wrong. Threnkal leaned forward. "And the 4,000 individuals marked for execution? Victims of a systemic flaw that should never have existed," Mira said firmly, "punishing them for a mistake built into the architecture of the Miracoli. Intergalactic communication would be like executing someone for failing to see in a spectrum of light their eyes weren't designed to perceive." The council fell silent again, and this time I could feel the subsonic conversation happening between them, a debate conducted in frequencies that made my teeth ache and my secondary arms twitch involuntarily. Finally, Shenva spoke. "The resolution of truth is upon us," they announced. "Translator Kensington, you have presented evidence of systemic error and offered solution to correct it. The Council must now determine if your actions warrant cancellation of the execution order." This was it. The moment where we discovered if 4,000 lives would be spared, or if Mira's brilliant gambit had merely been an entertaining prelude to mass death. However, Shenva continued, and that single word carried enough weight to make Mira's confident posture falter slightly. There remains one test. What test? I asked, speaking up for the first time since the tribunal began. Shenva's gaze shifted to me, and I felt the full weight of their attention like a physical pressure. Translator Kensington claims to have mastered High Tarkellian in 6 days and rewritten our translation matrix to capture nuances our own people required centuries to codify. Such claims require validation. The High Adjudicator gestured, and a panel in the floor slid open, revealing what looked like a medical device crossed with a musical instrument. This is the resonance verifier. It measures linguistic truth by analyzing subsonic patterns in speech. Tarkellians use it to detect deception, as our language makes lying physiologically difficult. You want to test if I'm telling the truth about the translation matrix? Mira asked. No, Shenva said, and there was something in their harmonic tone that might have been amusement or menace or both. We want you to prove you can truly speak High Tarkellian at a level that demonstrates genuine understanding, not mere mimicry. You will engage in Kalthresh, the conversation of depths, with adjudicator Prensha, our most skilled linguistic duelist. Mira looked at me, and I performed the Vraxan equivalent of a shrug, which involved all forearms making a simultaneous gesture of uncertainty. I had no idea what a conversation of depths entailed, but given Tarkellian culture, it was probably either elegant or lethal, possibly both. Prensha descended from their platform with movements so fluid they seemed to glide rather than walk. They positioned themselves opposite Mira in the central speaking area, and the resonance verifier activated, filling the chamber with a low hum that I felt more than heard. The rules are simple, Prensha explained, their voice carrying harmonics of anticipation. We will engage in philosophical debate conducted entirely in High Tarkellian, discussing a topic of my choosing. You must maintain perfect harmonic resonance, gestural syntax, and subsonic coherence for a minimum of 100 exchanges. Any failure in linguistic precision will be detected by the verifier and result in automatic forfeiture. And, if I succeed? Mira asked. Then the execution order is cancelled. Your translation matrix is adopted by the Council, and you will have earned something no non-Tarkellian has ever achieved. Our genuine respect. And if I fail? Prensha's crystalline form shifted through colors I didn't have names for. Then the executions proceed as scheduled. Your tongue is removed to prevent future mistranslations, and your rewritten matrix is destroyed as evidence of ambitious overreach. Mira stood silent for a moment, and I saw her shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath. Then she nodded. I accept the challenge. Prensha began without preamble, their voice filling the chamber with layered complexity that made my head swim. Define the nature of language. Is it tool or essence? Mira responded immediately, her words matching. Prensha's harmonic complexity. False dichotomy. Language is neither tool nor essence, but the bridge between thought and reality, the mechanism by which internal experience becomes external truth. Yet truth can exist without language, Prensha countered, their hands weaving patterns that added visual dimensions to their argument. A star burns regardless of whether beings exist to name it. A star burns, Mira agreed, her own gestures mirroring and responding to Prensha's. But burning is itself a linguistic construct. Without language to frame observation, the star is merely phenomena without meaning, event without interpretation. The exchange continued, accelerating in pace and complexity. They debated the relationship between meaning and sound, whether communication required mutual understanding or merely mutual acknowledgement, and whether silence itself could be considered a form of speech. I lost track of the individual exchanges somewhere around the 40th, too overwhelmed by the linguistic density to count accurately. But I could see the resonance verifier's readings, displayed on holographic monitors around the chamber, showing Mira's harmonic consistency, her subsonic precision, her gestural accuracy. She was matching Prenshaw point for point, not just mimicking the language, but genuinely thinking in it, using High Tarkellian not as a translation of her thoughts, but as the actual medium of her cognition. It should have been impossible. Every linguistic theory suggested that language acquisition at this level required years of immersion, that the neural pathways necessary to process such complex communication couldn't form in less than a standard cycle. But Mira was doing it anyway because, as I was learning, humans had a remarkable talent for ignoring what should be possible in favor of what was necessary. The 100th exchange arrived with Prenshaw, asking a question that seemed designed to be unanswerable. If language creates reality, and reality informs language, which came first, and does the answer matter? Mira paused, and in that pause, I thought perhaps she'd finally hit the limits of her ability. Then she smiled, and when she spoke, her words carried frequencies that made the entire chamber resonate. The question assumes linear causation, but language and reality exist in recursive loop, each generating and being generated by the other in perpetual cycle. The answer doesn't matter, because the question itself is language attempting to understand its own origin, thought, trying to think about thinking. Any answer we give is simultaneously true and inadequate, complete and incomplete, because we are using the very thing we're trying to explain to conduct the explanation. She paused, letting the harmonics settle, then added, which is why translation is never mere conversion of words, but always an act of creation, building bridges between different recursive loops and hoping the structure holds long enough for meaning to cross. The resonance verifier's readings spiked, then stabilized, then displayed a pattern I'd never seen before. Perfect harmonic alignment across all measured frequencies. Prenshaw stepped back, and when they spoke, their voice carried what I could only describe as satisfaction. 103 exchanges. 0 errors. Linguistic precision that matches council-trained specialists who have studied for 200 cycles. They turned to Shenva. The human speaks truth. Her understanding is genuine. Shenva stood, and all other council members rose with them, a coordinated movement that sent cascading light patterns across the chamber. Translator Mira Kensington, Shenva announced, their voice resonating through every frequency the chamber could produce. The High Council of Tarkellian Prime renders the following judgment. The mistranslation was systemic, not intentional. The execution order is hereby cancelled. The 4,000 individuals marked for termination are pardoned. Your revised translation matrix will be adopted and implemented across all council communication systems. Relief flooded through me with such intensity that my chromatic skin cycled through 12 different colors in rapid succession. But Shenva wasn't finished. Furthermore, you have demonstrated linguistic ability that exceeds all reasonable expectation and achieved understanding that honors our culture. Therefore, we extend an offer rarely given to outsiders. The High Council invites you to serve as the first non-Tarkellian linguistic adjudicator, a position that would grant you authority over all translation protocols between Tarkellian and Council communications. Mira blinked, clearly not expecting this particular outcome. That's a significant honor, High Adjudicator. But I should point out that I already have a job, and my current supervisor might object to losing his translator. All eyes, crystals, and sensory organs turned to me. I'll manage, I said dryly, despite the fact that finding a replacement for Mira would be somewhere between difficult and impossible. Mira turned back to Shenva. I accept the position, with one condition. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. Tarkellians didn't respond well to conditional acceptance. Speak, Shenva said, their tone carefully neutral. The revised translation matrix gets distributed freely to all council species, with full technical documentation and training materials. No proprietary restrictions, No access fees, no bureaucratic barriers. If we're going to fix intergalactic communication, we fix it for everyone. The council members exchanged subsonic communications I couldn't perceive, and the silence stretched long enough that I began calculating escape routes, just in case. Then Shenva spoke, and their words carried harmonics that might have been approval. Agreed. Your condition is acceptable and aligns with principles of linguistic clarity we value. Welcome to Enver, the High Council. Adjudicator Kensington. The formal ceremony that followed involved a lot of harmonic chanting and gestural rituals that I barely understood. But the essential point was clear. Mira had not only saved 4,000 lives, but had fundamentally changed how the Galactic Council approached translation and communication. Also, she'd been promoted, which meant I needed to file approximately 67 forms and requisition a new translator. Bureaucracy never sleeps, even after diplomatic miracles. 3 days later, we were back on Station Apex, and Mira was buried under a mountain of administrative documentation related to her new position. I found her in her office, which she'd already managed to fill with human cultural artifacts, mysterious beverage-making equipment, and enough data pads to stock a small archive. So, I said, settling into a chair that was definitely not designed for Vraxan physiology. How does it feel to be a linguistic adjudicator? Exhausting, Mira admitted, looking up from a holographic document that appeared to be written entirely in mathematical formulas. I've received 84 requests for translation review, 42 invitations to linguistic conferences, and 17 marriage proposals from species I can't even identify. The price of fame, I said. She laughed. Yeah, well, fame can wait. Right now, I'm more interested in making sure the new translation matrix actually works in practice. Theory is great, but implementation is where things usually fall apart. I have confidence you'll manage, I told her. After all, you learned High Tarkellian in 6 days and rewrote 4 centuries of diplomatic architecture. Compared to that, administrative implementation should be trivial. You'd think, she muttered, returning to her work. I stood to leave, then paused at the door. Mira, one question. How did you actually do it? Master High Tarkellian that quickly? She looked up, and her expression was thoughtful. Honestly, I didn't master it. I just learned enough to understand the pattern, and then I let the pattern guide me. Languages aren't really that different from music or math or any other system. Once you find the underlying structure, the details fill themselves in. That seems reductive. Probably, she agreed. But humans are good at finding patterns, even when we shouldn't be able to. It's both our greatest strength and most dangerous weakness. We see connections everywhere, and sometimes those connections are real, and sometimes we're just making things up. The trick is figuring out which is which. And, in this case, she grinned. I got lucky. The connections were real, and I had just enough time to follow them to their conclusion. I left her office thinking about patterns and connections and the strange species that saw them everywhere. Humans were still relatively new to galactic politics, still figuring out their place among civilizations that had been traveling the stars for millennia. But if Mira was any indication, they were going to be just fine. Loud, chaotic, and occasionally reckless, but fine. 3 months passed before I heard the full impact of Mira's revised translation matrix. Turns out, when you fix fundamental flaws in intergalactic communication, a lot of previously hidden problems suddenly become visible. 7 trade disputes were resolved when both parties realized they'd been arguing about different interpretations of the same agreement. 12 diplomatic incidents were retroactively classified as misunderstandings rather than intentional insults. And 3 species that had been on the verge of military conflict discovered they actually agreed on territorial boundaries, but had been using incompatible measurement systems. The Council's efficiency improved by 32%, which sounds modest until you remember we were talking about an organization that governed 73 species across thousands of star systems. Mira became something of a celebrity, though she handled fame with the same chaotic competence she brought to everything else. She gave lectures on linguistic theory, consulted on translation protocols, and somehow still found time to operate her illegal coffee-making equipment. As for me, I eventually found a replacement translator, though they weren't nearly as entertaining. More competent in some ways, less likely to start intergalactic incidents, but definitely less interesting. I missed the constant crisis management, which probably said something unflattering about my psychological profile. 6 months after the tribunal, I received a message from Mira, inviting me to a celebration on Tarkellian Prime. The mining consortium had officially launched operations, and the 4,000 individuals who'd been scheduled for execution were being honored as symbols of improved diplomatic relations. I attended, naturally, and watched as Mira gave a speech in perfect High Tarkellian to an audience of crystalline beings who 6 months ago had wanted her dead. She talked about language as bridge building, about the courage required to admit systemic flaws, and about the importance of clarity in communication. Then she made a joke about coffee, which somehow translated perfectly into Tarkellian humor, and the entire chamber resonated with frequencies that indicated collective amusement. Afterward, I found her on one of the observation platforms overlooking the Tarkellian capital, watching their pale sun set over geometric perfection. "Thinking about the future?" I asked. "Thinking about how we got here," she replied. 6 months ago, I was a translator with a decent job and no particular ambitions. Now, I'm a linguistic adjudicator with diplomatic authority and a growing collection of alien marriage proposals. Life changes quickly. "It does," she agreed. "But you know what hasn't changed? People still talk past each other. We've fixed the technical problems with translation, but we haven't fixed the deeper issue. Sometimes people don't want to understand each other. They want to be right." "Are you saying your miraculous translation matrix doesn't solve all intergalactic problems?" She laughed. "Shocking, I know. Turns out, better communication just means we're more articulate about our disagreements. Progress, then." "Yeah," she said, watching light refract through crystalline architecture. "Progress." We stood in comfortable silence for a while, and I reflected on the strange path that had brought us here. A human translator, a Vraxan bureaucrat, and a linguistic crisis that almost resulted in mass execution, but instead revolutionized galactic communication. The universe had a peculiar sense of humor. "So, what's next for the famous adjudicator Kensington?" I asked eventually. Mira smiled, and there was that dangerous gleam in her eyes again, the one that suggested she was about to make my life significantly more complicated. "Well," she said slowly, "I've been reviewing historical council records, and I found something interesting. Turns out, there are approximately 412 other species who applied for council membership over the past 2,000 years and were rejected due to communication incompatibility." "Mira, no." "Mira, yes," she countered. "If we fixed Tarkellian translation, we can fix theirs too. Think about how much we're missing by excluding species just because their languages are difficult. I'm thinking about how much paperwork that would generate. Paperwork is temporary. Expanding intergalactic community is forever." I sighed, all 4 of my arms performing the gesture simultaneously for maximum effect. "You're going to make me file requisition forms, aren't you?" "So many forms," she confirmed cheerfully. "But think of it this way. We're not just processing bureaucracy. We're building bridges." "You're insufferable." "I'm ambitious," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there? Though." She laughed, that bright human sound that somehow made the prospect of drowning in administrative documentation seem almost bearable. "Come on, Velk," she said, heading back toward the transport bay. We have 412 civilizations to contact and approximately infinite diplomatic impossibilities to make possible. I figure if we work efficiently, we can cause at least 17 intergalactic incidents before the end of the fiscal year. Your optimism is deeply concerning. Yeah, she said, grinning. But you're coming with me anyway. She was right, of course. I was coming with her, because that's what happens when you spend enough time around humans. Their particular brand of chaos becomes addictive, and their refusal to accept impossible odds starts to seem like common sense. We boarded the transport back to Station Apex, and Mira immediately pulled out her datapad to begin researching the first of the 412 species on her list. I settled into my seat, mentally preparing for the avalanche of forms, disputes, and crises that would inevitably follow. Somewhere in the distance, the Tarkellian sun finished setting with mathematical precision, casting light across a civilization built on linguistic perfection. And aboard our transport, a human translator who'd learned their language in 6 days was already planning the next impossible thing. The universe had no idea what was coming, but I did. And honestly, I couldn't wait to see what happened next.